To begin with, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be working again with Paula. We had a lot of fun, both writing the curriculum together and also then promoting it among teachers for the last few years. So happy to be doing an interstate webinar with one of my good friends and someone who's struggled to retire, really. When I was writing this opening slide, I was tempted to actually write a failed retiree as Paula's current occupation. But she told me about the DLTV patron, which I think is fantastic. So very well deserved, Paula.
Thank you, James.
Alrighty, onwards.
Okay. Most people would be familiar with this construct here from the Victorian curriculum, because for government and Catholic schools, it's a Victorian curriculum that you need to follow. And of course, non-government schools can use the IB, Victorian curriculum, Australian curriculum, what they like. But the focus for today is for us to look at student learning as a total, but to apply the constraint that we're really just going to zero in on the curriculum. What is it that is entailed in the curriculum? And then the when is the bands that are going to do it. Now, if you understand the what deeply, then it makes the pedagogy, the assessment, and the reporting part quite easy to deal with. Oh, sorry. Let's just have a look. You'll know what these, the various segments of the jigsaw, basically, the elements. So if we unpack the whole website, we've got the rationale, structure, we've got the learning in digital technologies, and one of those elements is the key concepts. Then we've got the band descriptions, which is sort of the narrative. It's the storytelling about what the progress should be within this unit and what band and what it's about. Then the content descriptions, out to the elaborations if you choose to go that option, and then the achievement standard. So it actually takes quite a bit to know how those pieces fit together.
So I would have to say, when we run a lot of PD across the country, Paula, the general take is that people are reading the content descriptions and the achievement standards, but often the preface material doesn't get as much of a Guernsey as it should, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment.
I couldn't agree more, and particularly if people are using the Australian curriculum PDF of the scope of content, because that doesn't even include the achievement standards. It just has the content description. So people could be forgiven that that's the actual extent. It's abstraction at the highest level. So let's just have a look at those pieces of the jigsaw and what their status is. And as you can see, the about part or the introduction on the Victorian curriculum website are all advisory. The rationale, the aims, the structure, the key concepts. And then you swing over the other side of the ledger if you're an accounting teacher and you know your debits and credits. Then we've got the band description and the elaborations, which again are advisory. And the only two elements out of all of the documentation in the curriculum that are mandated are the content descriptions and the achievement standards. And I just liken this a little bit to saying, if you only had two ingredients, which happen to be egg and milk, you were supposed to be making something. You had no method, no temperature, no instructions, no technique. It could be anyone's guess as to what you created.
It sounds a little bit something like my 8-year-old makes as an experiment right now. Thomas has no enthusiasm for recipes, but much enthusiasm for Dad tasting whatever random thing he's made.
Well, that gives you the creativity, the uninhibited side of it. But when we know as teachers that, and that's part of the student learning, that you've actually got a report on student progress, that there's accountability to your constituents, then really knowing what the intention of the curriculum is absolutely fundamental. What is it that holds everything together, so that ultimately you are providing the students with the best opportunities to be able to progress? And I think what bothers me, and I know that James and I, when doing a lot of professional development, and Nathan and Kev would know as well with DLTV, that part of this trick is knowing what's the key that unlocks the whole curriculum, so that you can actually unpack it, know the pieces, and then be able to pack it up again into coherent teaching and learning programs. And that is a real skill. And back in the olden days when I started teaching, it was like you were free-range chooks. You could do what you liked. The level of accountability is significantly higher now. So let's have a look.
All right.
James, over to you.
Thanks, Paula. So one of those things that if teachers don't get a chance to read through all of the preface materials and understand is the 10 key concepts. So I'm going to give you just a very brief history of the curriculum and our reason for why we're doing these things, and you'll see why the 10 key concepts are really both the structural design of the curriculum, but also the why. So this is Thomas. He was born 2 weeks before we started writing the Australian Curriculum Digital Technologies. Paula and Anna know Thomas well. In fact, Thomas probably has stored in his brain somewhere every single revision of the Australian curriculum, because most of it was written with him in a baby Bjorn wandering around the campus of the University of Sydney. This other shot on the other side is him earlier this year when I said to him, we need to take a photo for mummy for your first day of school. Try and look normal. And this is as close as it got. The reason I put Thomas here is because the whole time of being involved in writing, having a child of the same age as the curriculum has really made me think about the passage of time and what we're doing to prepare kids for the future with this curriculum. So if we go to the next slide, thanks, Paula. One of the biggest challenges in a technology curriculum is how long it needs to last. So we started with the shaping paper in 2010. We began writing in July 2012. Care of our good friend Christopher Pine. Things got held up for a while in the with a review of the Australian curriculum, where some dinosaurs said we shouldn't be teaching technology at all. So we removed those. The dinosaurs, that
Dinosaurs.
is. Exactly. In New South Wales, we first started teaching the K-6 and Year 7 and 8 parts of the digital technologies curriculum only February last year. And then if you take that first kindergarten student in New South Wales, project them forward 13 years of schooling, it's not until 2031 that the first product right across the country comes out of the education system. Now, if you add 3 or 4 more years of some form of tertiary education, uni, TAFE, etc., then we're actually talking a quarter of a century between when we first started thinking about the curriculum and when the first full product will come out of the other end of the system. Now, luckily, nothing ever changes in 25 years in computing. This is a collection of things that didn't exist 15 years ago. 25 years actually takes you back to the very beginnings of the retail internet in Australia. So Aussie Mail, for example, dial-up internet, forget about the era of complaining about NBN speeds. You have to worry about your sister picking up the phone while the modem was on. The world has changed dramatically in that time, and somehow we need to write a curriculum for kids who will really be already just at the beginning of their working life, living in a very different world to the one we started with when we were writing the curriculum. So how do we do that, Paula? Well, the answer is 10 key concepts, 10 key ideas that are not just true now, or not just significant now in digital technologies, but have actually been true for a very long time. In fact, some of these key concepts humans have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, and they're actually some of the distinguishing characteristics of being human. And all of them are ideas that existed in some form or other before we had digital systems as the way that we can execute those ideas. So mathematicians have been talking about algorithms, for example, for a very long time. and data representation is one of my favorites because humans have been doing it essentially forever. So I'm going to quickly whiz through all of the 10 key concepts. The first one is abstraction, and that's the idea of hiding the details of an idea, problem, or solution to focus on a manageable number of aspects. By the way, these definitions are definitions that the ACA has come up with. It's a mixture of the content in the preface materials of the Australian curriculum, but we've changed the wording so it's more classroom friendly down to a younger audience. So abstraction doesn't appear explicitly in the content descriptions, but it underpins all of the other 9 key concepts. Thanks, Paula. Data representation is essentially about how humans have communicated, stored, manipulated data and information using symbolic representations. And the critical thing here is it's not just about the ones and zeros in binary. We want students to have a deep understanding of all of the different representations they use, whether it's writing systems, whether it's number systems, whether it's art, music, and so on. There's all kinds of representations that students are learning about in school. And in digital technologies, we're interested in pulling all of those ideas together in one place. Thanks, Paula. So data collection and its sibling data interpretation, about collecting various sources of information, and then, thanks, Paula, doing the interpretation. The interpretation involves a mixture of things: visualization, analysis, modeling to extract meaning. And one of the things to watch out for, in fact, being involved in the review process for the Australian curriculum, we're very purposeful about the particular verbs that are used in particular places. So interpretation involves incorporating context, for example, but analysis typically doesn't involve pulling in that additional context. So we're bringing all of those ideas together in a hierarchy of verbs. Thanks, Paula. Next one. Specification is the formal definition of a problem, identifying the requirements, breaking it down into manageable pieces. One of the words that catches teachers the most out in the curriculum, in my experience, is decompose. We didn't bother putting that in the definition. Breaking down into manageable pieces seems a much friendlier way of saying it. Thanks, Paula. Algorithms is probably the algorithms and coding, or implementation as we call it in the curriculum, are probably the 2 most recognizable of the key concepts: the precise sequence of steps and decisions needed to solve a problem. And then implementation is, thanks, Paula, how we go about automating that. Now, typically, that's going to involve writing a program, coding, but it can potentially involve using other software to implement an algorithm as well. Thanks, Paula. Digital systems are the devices that we currently use to execute that automation. So, and we do that in binary. It's made up of hardware, controlled by software, and so on. Of all of the key concepts that's likely to change the most, this is the one. You know, we could have brain chips or quantum computing or whatever future technology. We know in some form or another we will have technology that's designed to automate an algorithm, and we'll have some mechanism to express that by writing code or some other representation. So digital systems in 25 years' time might be more than just processes data in binary. It might be data in binary and qubits, who knows? But some form or other there'll be a system to execute. Interactions I'm not going to say much more about right now because we're going to talk about it later on in the talk. And finally, we get to the cheerleader of the 10 key concepts, impact. So impact is all about the ways that digital technologies has made and remade every aspect of our modern society. And the phrase right now, disruption, is quite popular. Digital technologies, whether we like it or not, is disrupting every aspect of our world, our life, our working world, our social world. And we need kids to be thinking both about the opportunities that presents, but also the unintended consequences. And there's quite a lot in the curriculum on that evaluative aspect. Thanks, Paula. So Craig's actually put the link down the bottom. If you're interested, the 10 key concepts, there's a poster that you can download and print. We've got some copies in the ACA office. We normally hand them out at things like Edutech and so on as well. If you get in touch with us, and offer to provide some feedback or any thoughts on the curriculum, we can usually have our arm twisted pretty easily to send out some posters to you as well. Thanks, Paula. All right, so just one thing I wanted to point out. Now, of course, these statistics, I haven't recalculated them for the Victorian curriculum, where there have been some small adjustments along the way. But one of the things I think that's really important to understand about the Australian curriculum is that there's so little text to actually communicate the intent of the writing team. So in Foundation to Year 2, that's a glorious 6 dot points and 94 words. And by Year 9 and 10, you get to the relatively luxurious 200 words and a whole 11 dot points. And so one of the things that has always been frustrating for me as someone that wasn't involved in curriculum writing extensively before the Australian curriculum is that we have very little opportunity to truly explain the intent to teachers of what we were trying to achieve. And so that from that frustration, we started thinking, well, what are the ways that we can actually provide teachers with more advice and support about exactly what we were intending it to look like in the classroom? And I think, Paula, that's probably one of the key, probably the thing that we discussed the most, apart from wording and whether or not Oxford commas were a thing we wanted. One of the key things that we spent forever discussing is, what does this particular dot point, what does this phrase mean in the classroom? And yet I think we all shared the frustration that we don't get to write that in the curriculum. The elaborations don't really do that or don't function in that way right at the moment. But everything that is in the curriculum, we had multiple examples that were like, yes, that would be a great way to do that activity in the classroom, and it would fit within the time frame available within the indicative writing hours.
I think, James, James always used to talk about the limited budget, the content description budget that we were given. And while we wanted to be more articulate, I suppose, achieve some greater clarity, we were constantly having to be brought back to the quota that that we were given. And that is really difficult. And it just reiterates again, though, the actual importance of all of the packaging that comes with this curriculum. That if you really don't understand everything else around it, all of those advisory information, it does make it very difficult to actually accurately interpret the curriculum so that you can create teaching and learning programs which reflect what the intention is. And I always say, just at the end of the day, if you get really lost in what you're doing, go back to the aims. But if you also, and the approach that we end up taking and in the development as well, was to say, okay, let's have a look at what these constants are, which were the key concepts. And as James was saying, I like to think of them as the invisible threads, because they aren't badged anywhere. You can't, as James was saying, you can't see the word
Watch this space, Paula. I'm hoping that in the new curriculum we will have some clarity and hopefully a larger budget.
Yeah, because it is a fair amount of sort of guessing. You know, it sounds like first syllable, and there's a lot open to interpretation. So that was one of the major stimulus for looking at trying to unpack, because, as I said, unless you can unpack it properly, you can't pack it up into the right type of teaching and learning bundles.
So what we've got on the ACA website, and hopefully many of you have found this already, but if you haven't, feel free to have a look through now while we're talking, aca.edu.au/curriculum. And what we've got is we've taken each of the key concepts, align them back against the corresponding content descriptions for those key concepts, that clarity that Paula was saying about before. And then you can drill down into those in two different ways. You can either drill down from a band perspective, and then you can see all of the content that applies to that particular band level, or you can drill across. So here is the top-down version. And one of the things we've done here is that we've aligned all of the statements in the band description and the achievement standard with the corresponding content descriptions as you can see here. So, for example, this digital systems content description, we've broken up into 3 pieces. So the 3 key, I mean, we've given these things names, we've called them aspects, but we don't want to have new vocabulary because education is just a blizzard of vocabulary. So think of them as sub things. So there's a sub thing under digital systems. We've broken it up into 3 parts: the systems themselves, the networks that join those systems together, and then finally the security necessary to ensure the safe running of those systems. And we pull apart each of the content descriptions and describe and define and then describe the phrase that we've highlighted here. So, for example, where students are expected to identify and explore a range of digital systems, we talk about what that might mean. So in a classroom, what we want to do is we expect students to be able to do something like the following. Students identify digital systems that are unfamiliar by looking for characteristics and properties of known systems. And then for all of these, we've tried to put an example in brackets that we think is quite manageable in the majority of Australian classrooms. So for us, this is really the link between the conversations that we had all of the time when we were designing the curriculum and what we were formally allowed to include. So, Paula, in your original diagram where you had curriculum and then pedagogy next door to each other,
Yep.
but they're actually quite separate beasts. And in Australia, and it seems like in much of the world, including pedagogy in a curriculum is a no-no. I don't understand why, honestly. I actually think that teachers are always reaching out for new ideas for how to present things. And I think there's this assumption that we can't tell teachers what to do. But on the other hand, leaving teachers guessing all of the time is also really bad news and causes a huge amount of work for teachers to do. So to some extent, I consider this activity, what we've been developing with the unpacking activity, is that link between that first box and the second, and to a lesser extent, the third and fourth boxes in that diagram.
James, I think I view it as like the user documentation or the user guide. But also from a national level, I mean, each jurisdiction has its own particular way. So New South Wales, you know, you don't basically have any choice. You follow the syllabus. Whereas in Victoria, there is a far higher level of freedom, so that schools can develop a curriculum which meets not develop curriculum, develop teaching and learning programs based on the curriculum, taking into account the context, the setting, the community needs. So
is this the time when you remind me where Victoria is the education state?
Exactly.
And you've got number plates to prove it?
So that's why we have, you know, all the leaders. That's why, James, all of the Victorian curriculum people are sort of employed by ACARA.
Oh, I see. Oh, my. Wow, this is just getting worse and worse. Let's move on to the next slide, Paula.
We might have a copy.
So here's just another example of this breakdown. And one of the key things about breaking these into these aspects and then into individual elements is we want teachers to be able to see how each of those elements progress. So every single phrase, every single, you know, pair of wording in many cases between the two bands typically indicates that there's some change in expectation, but it's been made so abstract and so compacted to achieve the budget that this new version, I think, makes a huge difference to understand how that progression actually works. Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, thank you. Progression's the right word. I think what your responsibility is from a whole school perspective, and not just a class perspective, but a whole school perspective, is to facilitate student learning from 0 to whatever it is, to 6, or from 7 to 10, so that you know what the progression is, you know what the stepping stones are, you know how high the hurdle is at the next band. So the key concepts provide you with that opportunity to actually see what progression is like. And so the whole school needs to be making decisions about that progress. Within, if you look down in the vertical, that's what you might do within the packing up process to develop teaching and learning programs for your year level. But you need in the curriculum crossword to be able to set up teaching and learning programs which are in the right order, which allow students to move up to the next level. And as you would all know, that within your class, probably around maybe 70 to 80% of the cohort fit within that band. You're going to have students within your class that are at a lower level and those at a higher level. So really having that familiarity with what are the standards, what's the content at the lower level, and what is it at the higher level enables you to develop teaching and learning programs which are towards the target group, but you are able to tweak them so that you can take on board those students who haven't quite got the leg up to the level that they should be, and that you are not holding back those students at the higher end who want to progress. So I think you've really got to be very careful and mindful at a school level, not just a class level, about the notion of progression and coherence. And the key concept approach is absolutely superb for you being able to get the picture of the progression, and then you can look at that vertically as well, rather than just looking across, so you know what's going to happen in your particular class.
Yeah, and in terms of getting on top of the detail too, when teachers say this is quite overwhelming, the number of new things that I have to consider here, and in the first few years of implementation, which honestly many schools are still coming to terms with digital technologies, I always say focus on those 10 ideas. If kids leave your classroom with a deeper understanding of these 10 ideas, the particular technology they're using, while it's really important to develop those skills, that is going to evolve over time. The version of Microsoft Word that they will use when they're a professional is going to be, in some ways, very similar, but in other ways, quite a different beast. These 10 ideas are ideas built to last. Focus on them.
Yep, couldn't agree more. And the other thing I would say is that even if you have started and you are struggling a bit, pick those few ideas that you feel concepts that you feel confident with, view them as your major, pick up a minor that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Develop some competencies with that and confidence. That then converts into a major, and you then piggyback a new concept, which is a minor. So progressively you get there, but you've got to start small. Don't sort of pick your couple of favourite and drop the rest off the agenda, because you will never be able to, students will never be able to progress. They'll never be able to demonstrate the achievement standards, and you're just giving them a very, very watered down version. And in some instances, what some people are doing, for a range of reasons, not pointing the bone, but for a range of reasons, it lands up being digital technologies, it ends up being the default ICT capability. And we need to make certain that these concepts and the rigour associated with digital technology is respected. And part of our the progression that is illustrated through the concepts is we actually move, starting off from simple examples, simple content, through to complexity. And that's one of the elements in planning the learning. And it also helps you when you've got students in your class that have got the mixed abilities, so that you can actually tweak your learning activities to accommodate different complexity. And complexity can be achieved by the level of independence, the difficulty of the context of the problem, the level of fluency, are you going for breadth or depth, level of accuracy. There are a whole range of factors that contribute to the degree of complexity. So I think you need to be looking left and right as well as your own level in the concepts, so that you are quite familiar with the ways in which you can just modify those teaching and learning programs. Okay. What I'm going to do here is just look at, as James was saying, at one of the concepts, which is interactions. And interactions really should be broken into two concepts, because we have one which is our interaction of people with the actual interface, with the technology that they are actually using. It's not because the technology is mediating communication or interaction with other people. It is your actual way in which you experience or connect with the technology yourself. So what I'm going to focus on in unpacking this one is primarily on the human to human one. And what we have done in the concept, the unpacking, is really to look at three different sub-things, as James likes to call them.
Aspects. We'll keep using our term.
Okay, aspects. We'll run with that.
Sub-thing is just so hard to say.
Yes, so true. So these are sort of, I suppose, prongs that are like mental models for you to hang on to. So there are the elements in this one that you are using, you are communicating and collaborating with other people through the technology because you actually want to share and communicate information. Part of it is that you are wanting to problem solve. We can be looking at how do you collaborate, how do you engage with other people in a safe manner, and how do you actually apply protocols so that everyone is respected, engages in a safe and ethical way, and that their identity is protected. And then the other arm within this area is about your ability to plan and manage. So I'm not going to do any detail about the human-computer one, but we will look at the next one here. So let's just have a look at what these elements are within the Victorian curriculum. So the human-to-human one has a lot more content descriptions, and actually within the Victorian curriculum it sits under the data and information strand. And as most people would know, and James did say that the Victorian curriculum has some slight differences to the Australian curriculum. Probably the biggest one is just the structural thing. There are three strands. It's not just knowledge and understanding and then processes, but they go into digital systems, data and information. Is that me causing this problem? I can hear a lot of electrical interference. And human computer just starts from level 5 through to 9 and 10. So I'm just going to focus on the human to human. So let's just work on that notion of progression. And what I've just done here is tease out a little bit more, only for the purposes of you being able to see the progression even at a finer level of calibration. You don't need to break it down quite so finely, but I thought for the purposes of today, you can see what we're doing. So if we look at collaboration as one of the variables, the values that we assign to it from F through to 10 move from own and group, that means that under supervision, to online, then we got to meetings and strategies where the students are doing their collaboration with other known people, looking at strategies for maybe their file names, meeting times, what their file versions, and then how the 9 and 10, what are alternative ways in which we can actually engage in a collaborative way, which is respectful as well when dealing with other documents.
And in fact, one thing that's worth pointing out is this might seem like a bit of an unnatural, you know, we're pulling the curriculum apart almost like we're doing poetry analysis on right down to the individual phrases, but this is actually how we wrote it in the first place. I would have actually much preferred to just hand over some of our spreadsheets so that you could see how each of these little individual elements progresses in a way that's quite coherent, both in its progression and then how those things can be combined back together. But unfortunately, all of that needed to be smudged back into those dot points, and then it becomes quite hard at times to actually see how that's happened. So the unpacking is essentially the reverse of the process that we did in writing the curriculum.
Exactly. We used to affectionately call the document, if you put all of the sheets together, the bedspread, because it was so extensive. So if we look at what the students create when they are communicating, this just gives you a sense again of the progression of some of the things. So when you get up at the higher level, it matches a lot with what they're doing in collaboration, because you can see there's a far higher level of interactivity in what the students are doing. And the examples here, some of these have come from, I've extracted them from the elaborations. These actual examples aren't always what's written in the content description, but some of them are. So it's giving you the notion about, well, it's actually the combination between things taken out of the content description and what James has been saying that we do on the unpacking. We try to give some specific examples which resonate easily with teachers. So the planning again shows you that progression. So safety, again, you can see how we go from the supervised, the middle, pegging, looking primarily about identity and access, and then far greater discussion at 9 and 10. And of course, quite a bit of this, particularly at 9 and 10, has the connection back with digital systems, where we are looking at security of data for 9 and 10 under the digital systems concept. And then again, if we look across for communicate, you can see that progression. So that's where we're getting the horizontal progression, but you also need then to be able to view this in the vertical sense. And I do think that's very difficult for teachers, because you've got so many elements to actually look at. And that's why I think in the whole journey, you are actually best to try and start with some of the concepts that you feel comfortable with, and then you progress so that over a 2-year period, you are developing, introducing, developing, consolidating, applying to maybe something bigger. So if you look down, if you are a F to Foundation 1 or 2 teacher, and you were looking at the interactions concept, these are the elements that you should be taking into account when you work out what the unit of work is going to be like, or the little activities that you're going to do on a regular basis. So let's move over to 3-4, and you can have a look there at what it would be. So this time your sight of vision is looking in the vertical way rather than the horizontal. But of course, if you happen to be at 5 and 6, you need to look left and right when you're developing the unit, so that you're cognizant of the students who, as I said, might not be up to that band, or are at a level which is moving on to the other band. Of course,
and even still, even if all of your students happen to land right in the middle of the bell curve, Paula, you still have an obligation to know where your students have come from and where your students are going to as well. So really getting that multi-band planning within a school for coordination, because kids do things like say, well, they've already done Scratch, so, you know, why are we doing Scratch again? Now, I think there's a lot of merits to actually doing more with Scratch than just a once-off, but it does require coordination across the year levels, because students do have a tendency to think they've done something and there, can be gaps introduced if you don't have that coordination going on.
And I just reiterating again, thanks, James, that putting that emphasis on whole school planning so that we don't get the repetition where we get students marking time because they just continually are repeating things and they're actually denied the opportunity to progress. And so it is sort of incumbent on us to say, yes, as you said, most students might be within the target band, but you always need to keep your eye on where they should be heading. And back in the olden days when we had VELs, we used to have those progression points. And, there was a lot of merit in that because you were actually sort of saying, well, where should my students be if I think they're halfway through this journey? What are the elements? What's the evidence that I should be looking for when I think they're getting very close to being able to achieve the achievement standards or demonstrate the standards? So I think there was merit back in the olden days of VELs. So let's just have a look. Now, I just wanted to quickly provide you with something which was a bit broader thing to say that not only do you have to just look within the Digitech curriculum about making connections between the concepts, but you can also make connections with other concepts in other learning areas. And I've just been doing a little bit of work with developing a unit of work on the digital economy, and the other one is digital democracy that I've sort of looking at doing something with civics and citizenship and digital economy. So here we've got a whole range of, we've got the interactions, we've got impact, we've got digital systems, we've got data. There are a range of concepts which are shared actually between economics and digital technologies, which can make for very fertile learning programs. This is coming from the 9 and 10 economics learning area. But when you are looking at making connections, if you've actually got a really integral foundation that you are making connections on, and that is namely concepts, then you've got a solid foundation to build quite effective learning connections.
Yeah, and I think the opportunities to do this are enormous, Paula. So far, I think neither the Australian curriculum nor the Victorian version thereof really gives teachers anything like the support for linking together not just subjects via the general capability, which is probably the way that Akara would describe it right now, but actually saying, here are some genuine opportunities to teach these things in conjunction with each other. And for learning areas that teachers are more comfortable with, those opportunities come more freely or more self-evident. But in something like digital technologies, where teachers are still developing their own technical skills and confidence, it's actually a really big ask to do all of those things all at the same time. I think it's a vastly under appreciated professional skill of teachers, yes, to be able to take all of these many bits and pull them back together in that coherent teaching program is a real talent, and something that we don't give enough teachers. Don't give teachers enough support in developing those skills, I don't think.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And what, besides the educational value that the students get, because it is sort of real context learning, there are also those efficiencies that are gained for the teacher. Because if, like, I would drill down and have a look and say, well, what are common elements between interactions in economics and interactions in digital systems? How much do I have to teach a core part twice? You might be able to distill that and say, here are some fundamental principles associated with the concept of interactions. Really only needs to be taught once, and then you can put the perspective on the hat of economics and of digitech and say, and this is what these two disciplines bring to the equation when we are looking at real world situations that are not divided into or siloed, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the silos. So I think there's lots of opportunity for this, but I agree, James, you know, while we're still trying to unpack the curriculum, to actually pack it into teaching and learning units and then go and hold hands with other learning areas, and they are hands that you want to hold, then it's a huge call.
We've got a long way to go before we're at kumbaya between learning areas. Yeah. So I'm just going to finish up quickly by talking about some of the activities and resources we've got on the ACA website. If you haven't been there before, aca.edu.au/resources. So we've developed a lot of courses and content that are available on the Grok Learning platform. So if you click through to the next link, Paula, we've got some Scratch courses within the platform. So if you use Scratch within your school, but you find it a bit difficult to manage using Scratch's own classroom management, you can actually go and use Scratch or Microbit MakeCode, Microsoft MakeCode for the Microbit in the platform, and we've got courses specifically targeted to the Year 3 to Year 8 part of the digital technologies curriculum. Claudette, we are always keen to hold hands with the Australian Academy of Science too. Many of the courses have automatic marking, so here you'll see a course that's actually covering some content from the maths curriculum as well as the digital technologies curriculum at the same time. In fact, logo, total graphics, I think continues to be one of the best ways of actually getting kids to engage with not just the basics of geometry, but actually more sophisticated things like alternate angles, and talk about real world examples like how do you take a font from normal to italic? Well, you slant it, and how do you do those slanting calculations? Well, you end up using some of that Year 7 geometry that otherwise is a bit of a mystery to students as to what it's used for. We've also got a series of webinars that we've been running ourselves over the last few months. So thanks, Paula. Next slide. If you're interested in unpacking any of the individual key concepts or looking at some of the activities, you can find a bunch of recordings of those previous webinars on the ACA website. And I guess overall, right now, as we come towards the end of 2020, we're starting to think, what does 2021 look like in terms of ACA support? So very keen to hear from you about what you might find most useful on the next step in your digital technologies journey. We've been talking to Deborah Hicks from the Victorian Department of Education about how we can do more to work in Victoria, and we're keen to pick that up in 2021. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, thank you to you both, and some really fascinating insights there into the thinking behind the writing of the curriculum and the ideas there, and I love your emphasis on those concepts because they are largely unchanging, which is great. I just wanted to point to a question that was asked earlier about the A to D levels. I know I've seen these in the Victorian curriculum.
Yeah.
Is that considered, or is that part of how you've talked about the design of the curriculum at an Australian level as well?
James, you want me to just jump in
here?
You
start.
I do think that Victoria is the only state which has done that. I know that, and look, I could be wrong on this. I know that ACARA were very interested in what Victoria had done, but I don't think that they ever articulated the curriculum. That there might be some resources through the Australian curriculum website, but curriculum as being determined in the Victorian curriculum, A to D, to my knowledge, it's the only jurisdiction that has taken that that approach. And can I just say that when I was at VCAA, we worked very, very closely with the Victorian Education Department in the development of A to D.
So I think the closest resource that exists anywhere else in the country is the SCASA, the WA Curriculum Authority. I'm just trying to find the name of the things now. They've produced essentially a version of the curriculum, and of course the WA curriculum is their own version that's on a year-by-year level, so it's not quite the same as the national curriculum. But they've provided teachers with some alternative wordings for the different levels of achievement. So at standard, below standard, and above standard is probably the closest thing that exists. Essentially is an assistance with developing assessment rubrics more than altering the curriculum to support different groups in that A to D scheme that I think is a great part of the Victorian curriculum.
Just a couple other questions have come in. Brendan writes, how soon after this session will a recording be available? We will try and get that up within about the next 10 days, Brendan. Question from Alexander about Blender. Uses Blender in 3D modeling class at a secondary school. Is there a way to map that to presumably to the Digitech curriculum? I know a little bit about Blender myself. It actually is really sophisticated and has like its own coding and algorithm stuff even internally. But I think the way most people use it, one possible connection would be to create models that you would then use perhaps in Unity or some other software to make games. Do you guys have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think my first point was actually essentially what you said, Nathan, is Blender's a huge beast, and depending on exactly which subset of the features, whether you're using the Python scripting, for example, would substantially change which parts of the curriculum you could be addressing. I think there are opportunities potentially to connect it to representation to some extent. You're looking, and again, I'm now talking largely at a key concepts level rather than drilling down into the particular year levels, because because those 3D representations are in turn representations of things in the real world that you're either modeling objects. Those objects have properties, so there are some opportunities, I think, to lead into object-oriented programming in year 9 and 10. And if I remember correctly, the Blender Python interface is an OO interface as well. So I think there are definitely a few connections there. Alexander, very happy for you to shoot us through an email to help@aca.edu.au with a bit more information about how you're using it. And we can have a think about where those other opportunities might be.
Thanks, James. Question from Claudette for you both. Do you think the newness of the Digitech curriculum meant that there was more freedom to structure around key concepts? She compares it with the Science Australian curriculum, which has them, but not as clearly articulated and easy to understand as what you've shared today.
James, you want to go? Or
no, you have a crack, Paula. I'm sure I'm going to add more.
Yeah. Look, I do think we came to the table basically with a blank slate, and I do just remember probably the first time that James, Anna and I were in a room in Sydney in a car, and basically the first question we asked was, okay, what are the key concepts? What are the key concepts that we're going to have? And I think part of that was also an acknowledgement that where you have curriculum which is comprised of, what can I say, isolated or independent pieces of content that don't flow from A to Z, then it makes it very difficult to develop teaching and learning programs that support progress. So I think, yes, we didn't have a history. We probably didn't have as many states and territories jumping up and down because of legacies that they wanted to preserve.
Everyone agreed that what was out there needed to change. And so while it wasn't always clear what that change would be, there was a starting point that everyone said, we've got to move on from what is a very wide range of how computing had been taught around Australia, ranging from some bits that were still, let's say, borderline 1980s ICT skills, right up to quite sophisticated, but not necessarily very, quite sophisticated in pockets in different parts of the country. So that made a huge difference. The fact that everyone was prepared for change, I think, was important. But actually, I think, Claudette, you'll see in the new version of the curriculum, the idea of key concepts is actually one of the things that's been highlighted in the terms of reference of the curriculum review. It's probably a bit cocky for Paula and I to claim any any front running on that particular front, but I am very keen to see how that looks across the curriculum. I think this is particularly important for primary schools because you've just touched on one of my favorite rants, which is essentially we've compartmentalized so many things. There's so many ways of thinking. There's scientific inquiry, there's historical inquiry, there's systems thinking, computational thinking, and so on. We've created so many different silos and boxes. We really need to be looking for opportunities, at least in primary, to pull those back to a much more manageable collection of things. And I think key concepts and looking at where the parallels exist in key concepts across multiple learning areas is critical to doing that.
Yeah.